1930s, Canada was still recovering from the effects of the Great Depression. There was widespread unemployment and poverty, and industrial activity was sluggish. Most Canadians were more concerned with the problems of day-to-day life than with things happening thousands of miles away in Europe or Asia. Canadians had little enthusiasm for the troubles of Europe. The memory of the First World War was still fresh, and no one wanted to get tangled in another European bloodbath. But soon, decisions made in Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo would plunge Canada into a long and bitter war. In Asia, the military rulers of Japan had launched a bloody invasion of China and were looking further afield, to Southeast Asia, India, and the Pacific. In Italy, the fascist government of Benito Mussolini had also invaded another country. Despite international criticism, they had attacked and conquered Abyssinia, which is today known as Ethiopia. And in Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party had gained power and were expanding their territory. In the face of this aggression, the leaders of the Western nations had responded ineffectively. The British and French governments tried to satisfy Hitler and avoid war with Germany by accepting the Nazi demands. This policy was called appeasement. In 1936, Nazi troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized area on the French border. This directly violated the Treaty of Versailles, which had been signed after World War I. In 1938, Germany invaded and annexed both Austria and part of Czechoslovakia. In the late 30s, refugees began flooding out of Europe, escaping from the brutality of the Nazi and fascist regimes. Many of these people were Jews. Like many Western nations, Canada was indifferent to their plight and closed her borders to almost all of them. Partly this was because of the weak economy, but partly it was anti-Semitism. In September of 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. France and Britain were both allies of Poland, and when the Germans refused to withdraw, they declared war on September the 3rd. Prime Minister Mackenzie King was determined that Canada would assert its independence and join the war separately from Britain. So it was a week later, on the 10th of September, that Canadian Parliament declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. The mood in Canada was very different to the mood at the start of the First World War. There were no cheering crowds and no enthusiastic rallies promoting the glory of war. Too many Canadians remembered the bloodshed of the First War, and too many Canadians remembered the bitter split in the nation over conscription. Although committed to fight alongside Britain, King wanted to make sure that Canada's wartime burden would be as small and cost as few Canadian lives as possible. King had united the Parliament by pledging that his government would never conscript Canadians to fight overseas. Canada was unprepared for the major war it was suddenly involved in. The Army had less than 5,000 regular troops, and both the Air Force and Navy were small and poorly equipped. But despite the small size of the forces and the subdued mood of the country, men and women enlisted in thousands right from the start. In the first month of the war, more than 58,000 Canadians joined up.
I felt it was the thing to do. Everybody else was doing it, and I had no reason not to. I wasn't married. I didn't have any particular ties. So it was the thing to do, and I realized in those days that if you didn't, unless you had a good reason for it, you were looked down upon.
There was very little thought went into this whole experience. Very little awareness of the war. There was some fighting going on. Canadians were going to have to join in, and I chose the Air Force.
I was going because it was a thing to do. And that's what I'm afraid most people go to war for. It's a thing to do. I knew that this awful man had to be stopped, but really I was rallying around the flag.
In December of 1939, the 1st Canadian Division of 10,000 men sailed for Britain. The same month, Britain asked Canada to host an extensive training scheme for air forces of the whole Commonwealth. Mackenzie King was delighted. Here was a way to contribute to the war cheaply and at the cost of few Canadian lives. By the summer of 1940, troops from 2 Canadian divisions had arrived in England. Early that year, the Germans had invaded and conquered Norway and Denmark, but in France there was little for the Allied troops to do as they waited for the German attack. In the years before the war, German military planners had developed a new technique called the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. They used tanks, paratroops, and bombers to strike deep into enemy territory in sudden, highly coordinated attacks. Infantry would rush in behind the spearhead and destroy any defenders that had been left behind. This was radically different to the defensive trench warfare of the First World War. The Blitzkrieg became the model for mechanized warfare right to the present day. In May 1940, the German armies unleashed their assault on the West. Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland were all swiftly overrun, and the Germans plunged deep into France. The French army was shattered. Port of Dunkirk, 350,000 soldiers, mostly British, had to be evacuated across the Channel to Britain. They left behind almost all of their equipment. More importantly, they were driven from the European mainland. Shortly after, France surrendered. In 5 weeks of fighting, the Germans had won more than they had in 5 years in the First World War. For the Allies, the suddenness of the fall of France in 1940 was a profound shock. With France occupied, Canada became Britain's most powerful ally. In fact, the Canadian divisions were among the few intact fighting units left to defend Britain after the disaster of Dunkirk. In such desperate times, the Canadian government abandoned the idea of a limited war. The whole society was to be put on a war footing. The government even started conscripting men for home defense duties, but not for overseas service. At the outbreak of war, Canada's industries were still suffering from the Depression. C.D. Howe was appointed Minister of Munitions and Supply and became the driving force behind Canada's rapid industrial expansion. He sailed to Britain and, surviving a torpedo attack on his ship, returned home with massive orders for food, weapons, trucks, and just about anything else Canada could produce. Canadian factories expanded and installed modern equipment. Thousands of men and women were employed. Salaries rose swiftly. Canadian factories began to produce all kinds of equipment: warships, transport vessels, fighter and bomber aircraft, tanks, guns, and hundreds of thousands of trucks. Of course, all this had to be paid for somehow. Britain could not afford to pay for everything it bought, and Canada itself lacked the reserves to pay for the material it in turn was buying from the U.S. Some money-raising ideas from the First World War were used again, such as war bonds, war-saving stamps, and increasing income taxes. Canada also financed much of what Britain bought from her and signed an extensive agreement with the Americans known as Lend-Lease. Our armed forces grew quickly. The Army numbered more than 500,000 by the end of the war. Starting with 6 destroyers and a few dozen aircraft, Canada ended the war with the world's 3rd largest Navy and 4th largest Allied Air Force. The first Canadian Army units to fight in the Second World War were not in Europe, but in Asia, in Hong Kong. By the end of 1941, Japanese troops were sweeping south across China and had attacked Pearl Harbor. Although admitting that defense of Hong Kong against the Japanese was impossible and that any troops sent there would almost certainly be lost, the British asked Canada to send a force. The Canadians arrived just a few weeks before the island was attacked. Despite a brave and determined defense against greatly superior numbers, the outcome was never in question, and on Christmas Day 1941, the colony surrendered. The Canadian survivors spent the rest of the war in harsh Japanese prison camps. Of the 2,000 Canadians who sailed to Hong Kong, more than a quarter never returned. Back in Europe, Canadian air crews had fought with distinction against the German Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain in 1940, and the Canadian Navy and Merchant Marine were engaged in the long and desperate struggle against German submarines in the Atlantic. But while other Commonwealth troops had seen extensive fighting in North Africa and the Mediterranean, the Canadian Army had to wait in Britain, constantly training. By 1942, Nazi control of Europe was at its greatest extent, stretching from Stalingrad in Russia to Norway on the Arctic Circle. Italian and German troops had almost overrun North Africa, and in the Atlantic, U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. These were the darkest days for the Allies. The war was going badly. The Western Allies were under pressure from the Soviet Union to mount an attack in the West. The German invasion of Russia in 1941 had led to warfare on a scale which dwarfed the fighting on the Western Front. The savagery and brutality of that war was costing the lives of millions of Soviet people. So it's not surprising they were looking to the Allies to help by opening a second front. The Allies weren't ready yet to invade Europe, but the Allied command decided to launch a major raid on the French coast. It was intended to test invasion techniques and to draw German forces away from the Russian front. 6,000 troops were to take part, including 5,000 Canadians. The target was a small coastal town named Dieppe. On the morning of August 19th, the landing craft went in. The Germans were alerted to the attack. With neither surprise nor darkness to help them, the raid rapidly became a bloody shambles. Troops who were landed on the shore found no shelter from the intense enemy fire, and few of the tanks that made it to the beach got as far as the town. The landing craft made brave attempts to rescue the soldiers trapped on the beach, but many men were left behind. In the air battle, the Royal Air Force lost 106 planes, more than on any other day of the entire war. Less than half of the 5,000 Canadians made it back to England. In one day, 2,000 Canadians were taken prisoner. 907 Canadians died on the beaches of Dieppe that morning.
We were stationed right on the coastline of England, at a place called Denton, a little town called Denton, a little seaport, where a tremendous number of them left for Dieppe. Well, we knew something really bad had happened because a number of us were sent down to this particular village, and they started bringing back casualties. And they just, boat after boat came back with casualties. And some reports came out then that it had been an absolute disaster. And it wasn't until later on we heard that some of the regiments had just been absolutely decimated. Dieppe should never have happened. Dieppe was so badly managed. The fact that it was very obvious that the Germans knew everything about the Dieppe raid. They were just waiting for them.
The government and army both concealed the true extent of the losses in the attack. Even after half a century, there's still bitter argument about what was gained at Dieppe at such horrific cost. Allied commanders claimed that the lessons learned there ensured success on D-Day 2 years later. This was little comfort to the captured Canadians, who spent the rest of the war in German prison camps. Despite the losses, the Canadian High Command wanted its troops involved in a major campaign. So when the invasion of Sicily was being planned for 1943, a division of Canadians was included. They proved capable and professional soldiers and were joined by more Canadian units for the invasion of mainland Italy. Allied troops fought their way up the Italian peninsula from 1943 till 1945. Mussolini's government had collapsed, and the Allies faced battle-hardened German troops. The Canadians met strong resistance all the way, especially around the towns of Ortona and Rimini. It was a difficult and bitter campaign, fighting an entrenched enemy across a landscape crisscrossed by rivers and natural obstacles. More than 90,000 Canadians served in Italy. A quarter of them were either wounded or killed. While the First Corps was fighting in Italy, the bulk of the Canadian Army was in Britain, preparing to invade Europe. The invasion, the largest in history, happened on D-Day, June 6, 1944. On the morning of June 6th, the invasion fleet of 5,000 vessels carried 100,000 men across the English Channel to the beaches of Normandy in northwest France. This included 14,000 Canadian troops who had been assigned to take one of the 5 target beaches.
We were the first wave, which was scary in itself, knowing there was nothing in front of us. We landed just as it was getting light. It was really quite light, and we were told that we would land with relatively high tide, but the tide was actually way out, and we got ashore, and we had about 100 yards of beach to run over until we got to the sand dunes, and where, of course, they had barbed wire all along the sand dunes. And I had 2 things I remember, don't remember. One is that the water came up to about my waist when I walked into there. And the only reason I know how deep it was is I had a package of cigarettes and were wet halfway up. And I can't remember what the temperature of the water was. I remember running across this beach. Obviously, we were under fire because things were skittering all over the beach, and I never did hear anything. That was one of the strangest feelings I had. I was aware of a lot of happening around me, but I didn't hear anything until we got up, and then we had to go our paths. We had been so well trained that we knew exactly where we were. There was a little bit of a chateau close to the beach, and that was to be our first objective, to go in and make sure the chateau was cleaned out. I think evidence about how surprised the Germans must have been. The breakfast, which was still warm for the German officers in the chateau, was still on the table. And they weren't there, they had gone, they'd all pulled back. And then we just head right straight in there. We had a few little dicey situations on the way.
The Allies secured their beachheads and after heavy fighting drove the Germans back from the coast. The Canadian Corps then turned north, given the job of fighting up towards Holland and Belgium.
Well, I was wounded after a short while. I came back to the hospital. I went back again, and then I was wounded again by just being shot by a German. You very seldom see who you're fighting even. The second time we did see them, and we were advancing over open ground, and I was again shot a couple of times. That was it. I didn't hate the Germans or anything like that, and I haven't hated them since. I have, in a sense, no right to. They were doing their job. I was doing ours.
Right from the beginning of the war, it was clear that unless there was a constant flow of supplies across the Atlantic to Britain, the war would be lost. Canadian shipyards quickly retooled and began to build merchant ships and small escort vessels called corvettes. They were intended to sail with convoys to protect them from submarines. The Navy had no shortage of willing crew. It was more glamorous than the Army, without the long training the Air Force needed. In addition, it seemed to the politicians that a strong Navy and Air Force would be a way of providing an effective fighting contribution without having to suffer great casualties. If losses could be kept low, then there would be no need for conscription. The government decided to choose quantity rather than quality, putting as many ships to sea as possible, rather than having fewer well-trained, sophisticated vessels. This meant their enemies had a superiority in both technology and training. As a result of this policy, the German submarines inflicted heavy losses on Canadian convoys. Operating in teams called wolf packs, the submarines sent hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors to the bottom of the sea. In 1942, they even attacked ships in the St. Lawrence River. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and with it, the war.
I used to be appalled at the thought of submarine crews. But then I was also appalled at the thought of the merchant men and the merchant navy on that North Atlantic run, with, in the darkness, ships being blown up, and fellows working down in the stokehold, wondering whether a torpedo would come through the side of their ship, being able to continue their work, but hearing the explosions and knowing what was going on in the darkness in the Atlantic. That, to me, represented an incredible bravery. Unbelievable.
Clearly, something had to be done. In 1943, at a conference in Washington, the Canadian Navy was given the job of protecting convoys in the entire Northwest Atlantic. The British Navy re-equipped and trained many of the Canadian ships and finally broke the top-secret German submarine code. Gradually, the improved Allied navies began to turn the tide, and though the wolf packs remained a considerable danger until late in the war, they never regained the edge they had in the early years. Canadian warships were present in many other operations, from the Mediterranean to the North Pacific to the beaches of Normandy. With friendly skies and lots of room, Canada was an ideal place to train pilots and aircrew. At the beginning of the war, the Commonwealth Air Training Plan was set up here, bringing thousands of people from all over the world to learn about air warfare. Initially, most of the graduates entered the RAF rather than the Canadian Air Force, and even by the end of the war, only 40% of Canadian aircrew were in Canadian squadrons. A milestone for the Canadian Air Force was the creation of No. 6 RCAF Bomber Group, part of RAF Bomber Command. By the end of the war, it had grown to 14 squadrons. Flying mostly Halifax and Lancaster heavy bombers, many of them built in Canada, their job was to fly nighttime bombing missions to targets deep in the heart of Germany. The bombing was meant to destroy military and industrial targets, but in fact the bombing campaign had little effect on German war production. It did reduce major German cities to ruins. Allied air raids killed almost 2 million German civilians. At the time and since the war, there's been debate about whether the slaughter was justified. The bomber crews themselves were in extreme danger. By 1943, only 1 crew in 8 could expect to survive their tour of duty. Gradually, the odds improved as the bombers got better equipment and became more skillful. Of 17,000 Canadians who died in the RCAF, almost 10,000 came from Bomber Command.
Night after night, we prepared the aircraft and the crews got into them and went off to bomb the Ruhr and Berlin and Germany, where the loss rate was very heavy. Every night, some of them didn't come back. They knew, of course, that it was a very dangerous thing, but they also felt that they were contributing a great deal to the winning of the war, because, of course, for a very long time, bombing was all that we could do, but it wasn't like a sudden battle where a very large percentage was killed within a few days. It was a small percentage that just went on continuously. Although they were the enemy and we thought it was justified, nevertheless, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people were being killed as a result of our actions. I think they thought about London and Coventry and Amsterdam and what the Germans had done to our cities, and so this was now it was retaliation. And, in wartime, with all the propaganda that there is, and you're conditioned to do these things.
The RCAF flew in every theater of war. They hunted submarines far out over the North Atlantic, attacked the Japanese in the Aleutian Islands, dropped supplies in Burma, and fought in the desperate air battle over Malta. They flew fighters, bombers, transports, and naval aircraft. Despite their contribution in both combat forces and production, Canada had little say in the overall direction of the war effort. The British and Americans made all the major decisions, and, like other members of the Commonwealth, Canada had to go along with them. As the war dragged on and losses mounted, the government faced the prospect of sending conscripts overseas to fight. They had tried to avoid it because of the deep divisions it would cause between the French and English communities, but there seemed no other way to replace the casualties. In 1942, the government held a referendum asking to be released from its no conscription pledge. English Canada voted 4-1 in favor of releasing the government. In Quebec, the vote was 4-1 against. Freed from its pledge, the government still didn't introduce conscription. The summer of 1944 brought intense fighting in Normandy and Italy, and the replacement pools of volunteers were empty. Since 1940, Canadians had been called up to work in home defense. These men were known as zombies. Those in favor of conscription demanded some of them be sent to fight overseas. Facing a revolt from pro-conscription members of his government, King reluctantly agreed, and despite the opposition of Quebec, Parliament voted to send 15,000 conscripts overseas. There were riots in Montreal and revolts among the conscripts, but by the time they sailed for Europe, the Canadian section of the front had become quiet. Few conscripts were killed or wounded. Once again, as in the First World War, Canada had resorted to conscription. Once again, the nation was divided, and once again, conscription had little military effect. There was an ugly side to Canada which showed during the war as well. People of German and Italian backgrounds were harassed. One of the least justifiable acts was the internment of Japanese Canadians. Despite the opinion of the Army, the Navy, and the RCMP that they posed no threat to Canada, the Japanese Canadians were rounded up and shipped to the interior. Their fishing boats, homes, and businesses were sold off for ridiculously small amounts. Over 26,000 Japanese Canadians were moved from the Pacific coast to primitive camps deep in the interior, where they led hard lives and were all but forgotten by the rest of Canada. Many of these people, including whole families, were Canadian citizens and were born and raised here. They had done nothing wrong and broken no laws. The policy of internment was fueled by anti-Japanese propaganda, and few Canadians objected to the fact that tens of thousands of their fellow citizens were held in what were virtually concentration camps. The war brought enormous social and economic change to Canada as well. The Depression had meant too many people and not enough jobs. The war turned that situation on its head. Suddenly there were more jobs than workers. With many men away fighting, women flocked to fill their places in the factories, shops, and offices. It was made illegal for able-bodied men to drive taxis, sell real estate, brew beer, or make sporting goods. The wide-scale employment of women in responsible and demanding positions created a major change in social attitudes. 500,000 women worked directly in war production. More than 50,000 Canadian women joined the armed forces during the war.
A lot of the women who married during the war and were without children didn't really feel married. And we very seldom made very much plans for the future. We lived very much for the present and now. And we didn't discuss too much about when the war is over. It just seemed to be a presence that we had to cope with.
War brought shortages and rationing of food and fuel, and some things like tropical fruit and nylon stockings were virtually unobtainable. As in any wartime economy, a black market developed, but overall the Canadian people followed the rules and avoided profiteering. Some of the social and political changes taken during the war were far-reaching. Unemployment insurance was introduced in 1940, partly in expectation of another depression when the war ended and the troops returned. It marked a major shift in direction in Canada. This attitude was reflected in many ways. New radical political parties sprang up. Trade unions also became stronger during the war. With labor scarce, the threat of a strike was a powerful tool. The unions wanted the right to organize and to negotiate with employers on the behalf of their workers. To avoid a crisis, the government had to accept their proposals. King and his Liberal government could see the change in the public mood and, despite misgivings, adapted to it. In 1918, returning soldiers got little compensation for their war service. This time, it was different. King promised returning servicemen and women a generous training and financial package. He also supported family allowances to help large families avoid poverty. In early 1945, the Canadian Army was pushing its way north through the fields of Holland, up to the Rhine River and the German border.
We were advancing, and in front of us was the Hitler Youth. And they were, I'm sure, no more 14, 15, 16 years of age. Very, very arrogant, spit in your face. And a number of them had been captured. And it was just incredible. I still see them now, just those young kids, and with the feeling the way they did.
It was a difficult campaign, with the Germans defending behind canals, dikes, and flooded fields, but the Canadians pressed on. Thousands of Dutch civilians were dying of starvation as the Germans retreated, and the Canadian liberators were enthusiastically greeted. On April the 25th, 1945, Allied and Russian forces met on the Elbe River deep in Germany. A few days later, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. Shortly after, the German troops in Holland surrendered to the Canadians. The war in Europe had been won. Though the Japanese were still fighting, victory in Europe, or VE Day, was a great victory.
Today is Victory in Europe Day. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
VE Day dawned. In London, capital of empire, Canadian service people joined their British buddies in the celebration of the great day. London lived in the front line. London rejoices in the defeat of a foe who came too close to their home. Hollanders, too, have real cause for celebration.
In the Pacific, the war continued. Plans were laid for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, and Canadian forces were preparing to join the assault. It was expected to be one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war. Allied commanders anticipated losing up to 1 million soldiers in the invasion, with much higher losses on the Japanese side. The American decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs forced the Japanese to surrender before any invasion happened. After 6 years and tens of millions of deaths, the Second World War was over.
I was in Britain. I was still in hospital, in fact, in a convalescent hospital. And it was just an enormous sense of relief, just a staggering weight and a staggering feeling that now one can get on with one's life. You know, in a sense, the war was a day-to-day, a now experience, and one didn't think about things afterward. But comes the day when it's all over and you're in a sense free.
Thousands of soldiers returned home from service abroad. In 6 years, Canada had changed, but so had they. More than 1 million Canadians, a tenth of the population, served in the war. 730,000 joined the Army, 23,000 of whom lost their lives. 250,000 wore the Air Force uniform, and 17,000 of them were killed. By the end of the war, 113,000 Canadians had served in the Navy. 24 ships were sunk by the enemy, and 1,200 Navy personnel lost their lives. In all, more than 42,000 Canadians died in military service in the war. Less than in the First World War, but still a heavy loss of life. The nation had been split again by debate over conscription, but not as severely as in the First World War. Most importantly, Canadian society had been transformed. New roles for women had opened up. Canada now had a strong industrial base with the most modern technology and production methods. National pride and self-confidence were strengthened. At the end of World War I, Canada's independence was questioned by many other countries. After the Second War, no one could dispute that Canada had become a power in her own right. Canada was not a major world power, but it was clearly high in the ranks of the middle powers. The war had changed forever the lives of those who lived through it.
To me, the most dramatic experience was seeing some of my very good friends killed alongside me. That was probably the most dramatic thing. And once that happened, I said, gee, well, there's got to be a better way than this.